Hello, everyone. Welcome to Bungacast, the global politics podcast at the end of history, with George Hoare in London. Hello.
Hey,
Philip Cunliffe, who's in London, Canterbury, one of the two.
In Canterbury, yeah. Hey.
Hello.
They're not the same. London hasn't grown quite that big yet. But
no, it's true. Yeah. And myself in Sao Paulo, Brazil. And hello.
Hello.
Amber Lee Frost in LA. Hello. How's it going?
Hey there. It's good. It's been a while.
It has been far too long. Far too long. So let me tell you what we're going to be talking about today. We often talk on this podcast, certainly when we talk about society and culture, we talk about individualism and about atomization and how these are factors in politics. For example, the decline of voluntary associations like trade unions, or maybe how protest often today seems more about expressing yourself than achieving political goals. Well, some of these contradictory attitudes are most clearly expressed with regard to the family today, the family as an institution. A lot of people on the left, radicals, seem to want to tear it down or dilute it or at best ignore it. So what we're talking about today are proposals for family abolition and looking at how much purchase they have and what they say about the left, about radicalism, and about contemporary society, I guess. So in preparation for this, I was looking back at Christopher Lasch's book, Haven in a Heartless World, a study of the family. In the 1977 preface, or 78, I'm not sure, he says, many radicals in the 70s have rediscovered the importance of family ties, often without even having read Haven in a Heartless World. Some of them have come to this position out of a need to put their personal lives in order. Others have discovered the value of the family in the course of their experience as community organizers. Where once they found the family to be a bourgeois institution and a bastion of male chauvinism, they soon found that the working class family constitutes an important cultural resource in the working class struggle to survive. And I think that's a pretty decent summation of his concerns in that book, actually. But he's obviously reflecting on the wave of radicalism in the 60s and where that ended up in the mid-late 70s when he was writing. Today, though, we're kind of encountering a new wave of radicalism, the Great Awakening, which I guess you can date from something like 2012. And I don't know, but I kind of feel like we should be talking about a revolution in cultural attitudes, which is happening right now. And it's always an important question to ask about how continuous this is with the 60s revolt, because it bears a lot of similarities to it, but also some important differences. Anyway, with all that in mind, we have a book here which we're kind of using as a basis for discussion, amongst other things. A book by Sophie Lewis called Abolish the Family. And she's, I guess, emerged as a foremost advocate of family abolition. And she declares that ever since the capitalist victory over the long 60s, the shout for abolition of the family has been buried beneath a strange kind of shame. That seems to tally, at least with Christopher Lasch's observation in the late 70s. But Sophie Lewis maintains that it's back now. Family abolition is back on the table, and she dates this to 2015, when concern with abolition of prisons, of police, etc., has now also turned to the family. So perhaps family abolition was in abeyance for, 20, 30 years since the mid-70s, but now it's back. So, guys, we've all read Sophie Lewis's book, and we're not going to pretend that it's a good book and that it's worthwhile to read, but we've picked it because it maybe crystallizes or exemplifies a certain tendency, perhaps in exaggerated form. So just to get the bullshit out of the way, what are the bad bits of the book, so we can get that out of the way and turn to the more serious stuff? Who wants to go?
Yeah, I could kick it off a little bit. I just think some of I suggested that we get some of the over exuberance in the writing out of the way first, because it's. Yeah, I mean, I think there are actually some good points in this, and I'll try and in the book, and I'll try and make that case as we go on. But some of it is written in a very, very caffeinated way. There's a lot of descriptions which have a clear audience in the industry, not perhaps in the general public. And that's, I don't know, it makes you think, what is the audience of this book? Who's trying to be convinced here? And so when you read it, there are some bits where you're just like, there's some pretty strong language in this bit or that bit.
Amber?
I would say my problem, and you'll have to forgive me, I read Abolish the Family a while ago and like half a full Surrogacy now around the same time, so I'm probably going to like mix them up, but I think it makes sense to, it's her oeuvre and they're definitely related. I think a lot of my problems is that she makes a lot of normative statements sort of about what family is or isn't without justifying it,
Hmm.
or without making the argument that that's actually the organization of the family. Two, I mean, I think she argues that arbitrariness is what makes family bad. The arbitrariness of biology, which, one, I've got tons of non-biological family, so again, that's another normative statement. But I don't think arbitrariness is definitely bad. I don't think a lottery, in terms of who you end up with, is necessarily bad for you. I think having a family is a pretty good training for children to know that you don't always get to pick your company.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, I also, I mean, in talking about arbitrariness, some of her positions seem utterly arbitrary, and she swings
Yeah.
between declaring the family to be, one thing, this unfair lottery. This is the question of arbitrariness that Amber's just been talking about, but also that it's intimately tied to work, and that also it's a privatism, but it's also a haven in a
Yeah.
heartless world, and it's just completely undecided on it. Also,
I
I
would
mean, this is, this is peak millennial narcissism on her part, but the number of I statements, and not in a kind of confessional manner or in a way drawing from her experience, but just as a way to underscore a political point, she'll say what she feels like, which doesn't seem to me very much to the point. So she's just discussing the Soviet um, revolutionary Kollontai, and discusses that well, there was good things and there was bad things, and then she went with Stalin and blah blah blah, but there's no ignoring her capitulations. Yet one can still derive, I feel, considerable pleasure from the fact that for several decades she was the best known ambassador from the USSR. Well, I'm glad that that gives you a feeling of pleasure.
pleasure.
It's
Yeah.
quite nice, yeah. And just in general, I think it's the book is like filled with these declarations where you're like, okay, so you're talking about this thing, and then suddenly you realize that in fact the reason for family abolition is that it's a decolonial imperative, and all traitors to the white race, the way that she describes herself, should embrace this position, which is nice that KKK kind of language is making a
Yeah.
comeback on the radical left.
Yeah. It's
Great,
good that we're
that's a
using
nice
that.
innovation.
Yeah, I would add to that is a broad ambivalence about everything, and broad equivocating, and a lot of cognitive dissonance. Like she has trouble holding a position about anything. Birth is horrible and traumatic, but also it's no different from any other work. Is a good example. Like it is different, but also it's just like anything else. Well, you got to pick one.
Yeah, and at the end we learn that actually immigrant families should not be separated because this is a bad thing, but families should definitely be abolished. So
That's the whole book. Yeah.
yeah. So anyway, so now you're listening to this, listener, and going, "Why the hell are you talking about this book? It's terrible." But again, we want to kind of explore why these attitudes to the family have a certain appeal on the left, if they do, and maybe question whether they do, in fact, have that, and kind of what it says about maybe the family more broadly. So this is just a sort of entry point. But
I want
I
to
guess
know what Phil has to say. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I was going to say, I think she's. I think one thing that can be said for it is an attempt to, seriously engage with Shulamith Firestone's ideas. I think is probably overdue, but
Yes.
this isn't it. So that's, I guess, the issue. But it's worth. I guess it's worth recognizing the fact that she sees something there, and thinking how she mangles some of that, I think, is also kind of worth thinking through as well. So, for the listeners who are wondering why we're doing this, given our kind of general skepticism, which I share, I agree with what everyone's already said. But yeah, I think there is something to the to trying to think about Firestone's ideas and why they might not work, which is a separate question from why Lewis's arguments might not work.
Yeah, nice. I think I'm glad you made reference to that. We're going to talk just in a second about how Lewis's account of the family and her proposals relate to other earlier radical proposals by both the New Left and the Old Left that preceded it. But I guess just to set this up, what is family abolition? If we take Sophie Lewis as the exemplary advocate of this position, what problems does family abolition address?
I think that the big thing is she's very anti the arbitrary. So I think she says, well, I know she says that it's uh, a corrective to sort of biological determinism, and sort of whatever, like not extending the family to people outside of blood relatives, which again is insane, because that most people's families are extended through marriage, even, or whatever. That's a non-blood relation thing. I think she points out that the family is like the source of most abuse, but the stuff about abuse is a little difficult because I'm not sure she has much of an understanding. Okay, I will say I only know this from an American context. But the majority of abuse cases in America are actually cases of neglect, not a kid being beaten or sexually abused. It's an inability to care for child as opposed to like predating on them. It's been criminalized essentially. I mean, you can go to jail for truancy in this country if your kid skips school too much. You can go to jail if you leave your kid in the car because you have to go to work. Um, uh, Boy, I'm really out of practice with podcasting. But
No, but I think the
yeah,
image that she depicts, because at the beginning of the book, she's like, when you think of family, don't think of this nice kind of rosy picture, perhaps derived from the 1950s of the nuclear family, but instead think about the mafia. Think about that's the sort of family you should think about: mafia movies, or the British royal family, or the deadly logics of eugenics, honor killings, femicides, etc., etc.
think
So
about the minority of things. Like,
yeah,
don't think about how it usually presents. And I would say too, like, there's the trauma, abuse, things like that. She makes kind of a causation, correlation, conflation. I hate that I rhymed that, but it's like, well, yeah, obviously most of it. Who else has the opportunity to abuse a kid? But
yeah,
experiments in collective parenting have a way higher rate of abuse. I mean, like any
yeah, smaller
hey,
sample, but definitely higher rate.
any utopian community, you give them 2 weeks, someone starts fucking kids. Like, it starts out great, and then the multiple marriages and the kid fucking started.
Yeah,
It's I mean, but the thing is also, like, I don't know, that saying, like, The Godfather is an unappealing picture of family. I mean, that's true, but on the other hand, everybody likes to watch The Godfather as well, right?
Yeah.
And everybody sees kind of dynamics of their own family within it.
for
Like
sure.
Fredo, like a dominant patriarch, like this a son kind of making his bid to take over, sibling rivalries and all of that. I mean, so it's a very odd, kind of saying, think of the mafia, and that's why family is bad. Is a
Yeah.
very odd way to kind of try and put you off family.
It's very romantic. I mean, like, think about
Yeah,
how many mafia movies. I saw Goodfellas in the theater last week. It was like,
yeah,
And
it's,
for all its
yeah,
faults, right, it will protect you from the outside world, which is, what the cell of the family is or should be in theory. And that Sophie
yeah,
Lewis actually, where she gets it very wrong, is that I think what she sees as the primary enemy for her, and why the family is complicit with the bad things in society, is privatism, basically, that it closes off people from the outside world. And what actually happens is probably that the family is not very successful nowadays in doing that, because the family is kind of broken up, penetrated, etc., from the outside.
yeah.
Yeah,
It's a
So,
good
there's
it's a
so,
good point,
so like
because
the
the
mafia. So the
privatism.
mafia actually, I mean, you were kind of doing this maybe somewhat in jest, but the mafia actually represents kind of, well, they might kill you if you step out of line, yeah, but they're going to protect you from the outside world. It's a pretty tight knit unit.
No, okay, but yeah, no, sure. So the mafia was like, the kind of the rural, kind of self protection that the Italian peasants developed to protect themselves from the predation of the state, and it's transplanted to the East Coast, whatever. But it's more, it's not even. I'm not even saying that. Like, I'm just saying that the romance of the mafia movie, kind of, it already acknowledges. The point is that it acknowledges the kind of the bad part of family and builds it into the account of family life. I mean, I think ordinary people kind of know that families come with good and bad. I mean, you'd be a very odd person to kind of not already to incorporate the kind of the complexity of family into your account of family. The idea that everyone's a dupe out there and is bought into some kind of idealized image of the family from the 1950s is already, it seems to me kind of misplaced.
Yeah.
So
I think it's more common today that, and this is not what she does, to have this kind of liberal social engineering critique of the family. Like, the family is bad because it's the site of all the reproduction of inequalities of various different sorts. So we need to undermine the control that the parents have over children because we want to rectify all these social inequalities. That's not the approach that she takes, but I think that seems almost like the current default, like, skepticism of the family. I don't think probably that many people buy into the ideology. I don't know.
who the hell believes in privacy, right? So the idea that everyone is kind of shuttered up and terrified of the outside world while they're abusing their kids, kind of protected from, kind of the social workers and the cops and all that. I mean, that doesn't exist, right?
Yeah, Sophie Lewis watched The Brady Bunch and thought she was reading Flowers in the Attic.
Yeah, so just three claims that come through the book in kind of potted ways, which maybe it's worth setting out. So Sophie Lewis at one point early on describes the family as a harsh lottery, i.e. the idea that children don't get to choose their parents, which is kind of a nonsensical statement because, parents socialize children. Children aren't just these autonomous actors that spring into the world and get unfortunately attached to their parents. They're products of their parents, in one, whether biologically or socially, and often both.
Sorry, just jump in.
So go ahead, yeah.
They're products of lots of things. I always say, when I worked in daycare, I realized parents both over and underestimate the influence they have on their children. Like, you're not going to control their interests. You're not going to control their moods or their general personality or things like that. That's not really things you can shape too much in terms of intervention, or rather you can present them with a crossroads. They will notice if you're miserable all the time. In that way, you do influence them. And everything else, like, they do go to school. They are in the world, even, in the rural places I've lived, like, they are socialized by people other than parents already. So this idea of, like, parents as especially being from the UK, like, you can't even, like, homeschool there. Like, there's no doomsday prepper, natalist.
There are some, not many, but
it's
much more difficult to homeschool and to kind of build a bomb shelter. And
that's what I think her strength is too, is that she does believe that children should be, and I agree with this, should be more integrated with a broader world, and both in terms of, like, support, but, hey, what about nationalized daycare and more playgrounds and, like, more resources for children, more child-friendly spaces, like, that's enough. Most public schools, again, like, it's just...
Yeah, noticeably, she's kind of sneery about these things as a kind of wishy-washy moderate position. I mean, this is not so explicitly, but, she kind of goes, but that's just about kind of helping the family, or, extending the family or the bounds of care beyond the nuclear family. No, we need to abolish it. We need to stake out a more radical position. But there's two other claims I wanted to bring up. The family is an ideology of work, which is a kind of clunky way to phrase it. But anyway, she's closely associating the family to work. Is she right about that? Is that a fair description at some point in history and isn't today anymore? Phil?
I think it's the most dystopian aspect of what she argues, in effect. Because it's that, it is work in the sense of, like, the basic, social reproduction and kind of maintaining oneself and, one's kind of dependents and partners and what have you. So, obviously it is work in that sense. But when it's brought into, when she's trying to kind of make it equivalent to unpaid labor and to make that kind of, that move, that seems to me like it opens the door to all sorts of deeply sinister and dystopian ideas. The idea then is like, if it's work, then why not just make it all contractual? So from her point of view, like, she's seeing it from the idea that this is work, and work is intrinsically exploitive and oppressive, and wouldn't it be better if it was kind of organized on a different view, on a different line? But in the current context of kind of late stage or decaying neoliberalism, in which there is absolutely no meaningful kind of political alternative, all it means is, like, to frame it in those terms is to make it another kind of another site for kind of potential commodification and colonization by NGOs and social workers and whatever else.
Yeah, I think too. Nevada Majumdar, I think, wrote sort of a criticism of her book on surrogacy that it's very good and worth reading. But it does become a little, I think she does it really well, but it becomes a little bit difficult when the anti-work position argues for almost an exchange of the commodification of everything. And she's sort of like, she's described, fetuses as like a bringer of carcinogens. And it's like, well, a fetus is a cancer in your uterus, but capitalism isn't.
Right. So what kind of exchange? You mean that, like, the kind of UBI position, for example, is that you allow everything to be commodified in exchange for not having to work, basically? Is that?
Yeah, I think there's you get your little gerbil pellet and everything, and you don't have to work. But it's so anti-work, and I'm not an anti-workist, like, either, in the sense of what it means now in terms, I think we should all work less and things like that. But I think meaningful work is actually a pretty good part of life. And a social obligation. And what counts as meaningful, I mean, as a podcaster, don't worry, it's a pretty wide range. There's a lid for every pot. Or maybe after the revolution, I would be carrying garbage, but I would only be doing it like 20 hours a week. I'm okay with that too. You have to sort of find meaning in your work.
That's Alex Gorovich's revolution, not the revolution that we endorse. Don't worry, Amber.
Yeah,
I won't be carrying
board
garbage.
That. I was. Yeah.
But I think to be able to conceive of doing anything that exerts energy as anything other than work is a little bit strange, because people often have, and historically have had, children quite voluntarily. And I don't mean planned. I think it's very funny when people say, well, it was unplanned. And it's like, what are you like, that's been every child in the world up until 1956 in a small corner of the population. Like,
right.
That's talk about a lottery. But I don't know that thinking of that as work really makes any sense, because she said the only difference between that is a wage. And I'm like, that's a pretty big difference. Like, the wage, I don't know if you're a Marxist or not, but for us, wage, very big deal. Very big deal, wage.
Yeah. I mean, it's not even just an observation that, well, there's a lot of unpaid work that goes on in the household, which, wouldn't count as an insight in 2023. But, nevertheless, at least that would be something. It seems to be that she wants to literally conceive of it as work. This question of work is important, and we're going to come back to it, actually, because we need to discuss how a broader concern with care relates to the way that the work is seen, I guess, in a lot of kind of radical propositions today. One final point where I think Sophie Lewis comes close to insight. Again, by insight, it's something, just repeating something that's been done for over a century, but nevertheless, almost stumbles upon a good point, which is that the family is a shield that human beings have taken up to survive a war. Well, indeed, but she, after acknowledging this, says that basically, shouldn't we at some point want to end the war and put down the shield? Which, okay, Interesting. Let's see how that goes. Though it seems that her proposal is to put down the shield of the family, and then the war will end. Which seems to me to be a way of waving the white flag and going, yes, I will submit to the war of all against all, and the war of capital waged against humans, and that's what then we'll just have to live with that, and hope
Yeah,
that something utopian and good comes out of it.
but what war are, say, like the bourgeoisie or people living in traditional societies? I guess you could say nature if you have to go out and hunt every day, but like, what war are the bourgeoisie fighting against? Or are they just the only people for whom parenting and children are permitted to be a joy?
Right, but even there, the degree of competition, getting kids
I,
into the top schools, is a war, of course, in a much less consequential way than for the majority, but nevertheless.
I think. I mean, I think it might say something about her own kind of outlook, as much as any kind of objective account of social, society today. That she sees it as, society is nothing but these kind of individuals locked in this war with each other, and the family is one mode of protection. But she sees it as this, she has this kind of deeply, um, yeah, I guess Hobbesian kind of view that there is nothing but kind of this raw competition, and that, I mean, as critical as one would wish to be, that it does seem to me to be one-sided. Well, one-sided. It doesn't seem to me to be real. You know.
Well, it
Yeah,
depends what you start with. I think one of the starting points that I would say she has is that the individual is fundamentally vulnerable and does need some protection, and kind of flips this idea. The family gives this protection to know the family is actually the source of, the people, the war of all against all. The people who are closest to you are the ones that you're warring against the most,
Nice, yeah.
kind of aggressively. So if you were able to maybe subtract yourself from that entirely, that would be a good position in the state of nature. You could, I think it's like Fortnite, you could go and hide or something when
yeah.
everyone's trying to attack you.
I think
But
that's right. That is right, isn't it? It's because the world is filled with abusers, right? I mean, this is where we're getting to kind of a much more mainstream view, not necessarily Sophie Lewis's view, right? The world is filled with abusers. We're all vulnerable and need protection from them, and the family is a way of enclosing that behind walls and allowing abuse to go on without
Right.
without anyone stepping in, basically.
There's
And
a lot of violence in prison, I think, is like a way she would think of it.
yeah, nice. I think that's right. So to leave Sophie Lewis to one side, we'll come back to her, no doubt. But how does her account sit in relation to other earlier radical proposals, indeed ones that Sophie Lewis herself discusses, whether it's Friedrich Engels or Shulamith Firestone? How do we kind of compare these? Because I think a lot of people who are fans of Sophie Lewis and who would see themselves as Marxists or communists or radicals in some way would claim a lineage with these earlier radical movements and say they were against the family, they were for moving beyond the family, and we are too. So are they
It's worth
correct?
asking though, before answering that, it's worth asking who are the fans, right?
Yeah.
Who are the fans of Sophie Lewis? Because she's had, I mean, as so listeners will see the the interview in Vice where she goes through some of the responses that have been, that her arguments have met, and so she's had, kind of amusement, outright kind of outrage and criticism from across the board. And so, clearly, I mean, she's got, she's a known kind of public figure as a result of these arguments, but it's not clear to me that there is kind of a very distinct constituency that has articulated its support, where there has been plenty of criticism from across the political spectrum. So it's worth saying, who are her? Does she actually have a clear kind of set of supporters, or is she known for the fact of being a controversialist? Because it's not clear to me that, I mean, I can think of all the kind of people who might support her, but I don't know if they do, actually support her.
Yeah, I think the thing is that she's a provocateur, like that it's abolish the family and full surrogacy now. Like those are provocative titles, which I think I would be, I think generally makes me not take someone that seriously, for better or worse. I think if she was a more literary writer, I'd be okay with it. But it's like, well, and I talk about feminism turning away from user facing to industry facing. It's like the techification of America, where it's like, well, nobody asked to have to use the dongle, like, but they added it because they're like, well, of course, an Apple employee or a tech guy, have the AirPods. You shouldn't have to, plug in a thing. And it's like, well, the rest of us are doing that.
That's the phallocentrism that we're trying to get beyond. Like, get rid
Yeah.
of the dongle.
I knew
But I
you were
think-
going to make a dongle joke. It was
Yeah.
inevitable.
But I think the thing about sort of feminism more broadly is that it's no longer women facing, it's feminism industry facing. And I think rather than fighting for an ideology or a politics, she's trying to carve out her space among people like her, people in publishing media, I would say politics, but not real politics. It's not like there's a politician that's talking about Sophie Lewis. This is like a very rarefied kind of internal economy of thought. And I think that's worth pointing out. At the same time, normally I would say that this makes her like a marginal nut or whatever. But I think the fact that she's an extreme version of like a kind of a few odd sentiments, the fact that her lineage, which by the way, I don't know if you meant to make a pun there, comes sort of from, Firestone and Ingalls, or, if you like, doesn't, but she claims them. I think she does have some right to say it's her lineage, but, maybe they had one kid that was fucked up. Yeah, you get a rotten one every once in a while, but I'm not sure. I think it makes sense to think about her as a morbid symptom, and the fact that in this time, this argument, as families are being broken up constantly and have been for a very long time, as like one of the big demands for welfare is that you could have a boyfriend or a husband that lived with you, in project housing, because it broke up families because women were forced to appear as single mothers. In like that situation, to say abolish the family is so removed from what people are currently fighting for, is to sort of keep their families together. Even she talks about like migrant work, migrants and refugees and stuff like that, not being separated. And it's like, say that to them. Like, go into the world, walk up to someone in the supermarket, start a conversation in a bar. It's just a good test. Like, can you work this into a conversation with a normal person without them suddenly smiling and, in that frozen way and being like, that's interesting, I have to go.
Yeah. Pretending to check their phone and just leaving.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess one thing that I was thinking is whether this, whether there is a potential constituency of essentially like middle-class, downwardly mobile millennials or maybe Gen Z. But I mean, if there is an extent to which the generation left or the generational discourse, which is like anti-parents, can be generalized into anti-family, because there are some objective reasons why, there could be that kind of generational tension. But yeah, I think that would be a bigger constituency, but still there's a bit of a way to go from like boomers have ruined our life chances to like,
abolish
to
the
make
family.
that a general. But it's in the same sort of.
No, I think you're right.
ballpark.
I think it is kind of it is in line with the kind of the discourse of war between generations, and it's kind of a continuity. So when she says abolish the family, what she's really saying is kind of free up the wealth that the boomers kind of have tied up in their big houses, that they managed to get, and let it be kind of shared out among me and my hipster friends who live in like small, kind of cramped accommodation in these nice parts of town where we want to continue living, but it's too expensive, can't get really good jobs. And I mean, I know it's kind of, perhaps it's an easy, perhaps it's a blow below the belt, but it seems to me it's very, it's like frustrations in her private life that are kind of turned into a social theory.
Yeah.
Not that there's anything necessarily wrong with that. You've got to start with your lived experience.
Well, you got to start.
etc.
You got to start. You got to start with something. It's true, but I can't help but see it in in those terms that there is. It's kind of a radicalization of the anger at parents, essentially.
Yeah, normally I said I tend to stay away from things like, biography if the person doesn't bring it up and they're alive. If they're dead, fair game. Um, but uh, she does bring it up, and I'll be more below the belt than you. That girl's messed up. And I think the degree to which she both has like cognitive dissonance constantly throughout the book, because I think that is real. I don't think it's completely like cynical, get the media class to write about me and piss off right wingers or whatever. But to the extent that she holds these ideas in their head, like she talks about like in the surrogacy book, she has this traumatic thing in her childhood where they had seen a play at a friend's house, already just like we were having high tea on the like already big class indicator. And there was like some premise where there was the paternity of a child was in question, and she was like, that's ridiculous. You'd still love me if I wasn't, if I was the milkman's kid. And she said her dad didn't say no, he just didn't say anything. And it's like, it was just devastating for her. And I was like, lady, you're almost 40. Like, I mean, really though, it's like, if you want to have bad dad competitions, I will beat you. And we all got daddy issues, but if that's still devastating to you, also what, your dad's not allowed to think about it? You're an adult now. It's not the best way to parent, but like your dad isn't allowed to have his consciousness raising journey about what it means to be a father. We didn't invent like what being a father was until like 5 years ago. They don't know what they're doing. Like,
yeah,
well,
I mean,
it's telling
that Vice piece, it did make me sort of think that actually in some ways it would have been more compelling if it had been like, I don't know, if she had sort of said, oh, and obviously this isn't her biography and you can't like change your biography just for the sake of an interview, but like here I had this like perfect nuclear family upbringing, it's all fine. And even at that kind of, the perfect exemplar of that, it still has all of these contradictions. But it seems, yeah, I kind of wish I hadn't read that Vice interview, because it made me, and that's not necessarily what you should do as a reader, project the biography onto the, the theory, but I just I should have just stayed away from the biography and just handle the theory on its own terms.
She comes through so strongly
Yeah.
in the book, like it feels like you're sitting in a bar with her and her telling you this, in part because it's so unstructured. It sounds like she's just sat down and wrote what was in her head right at the moment. But there's also denial, which isn't very convincing in the book, which says, no, family abolition is not a puerile politics, albeit children must be on the front lines of imagining it. Which sounds like she's talking about her, which is terrible. And also sounds like she's talking about herself, the child, imagining this future.
She wants to be baby forever. I mean, that's the indication here. It's like, we all need care. I want to be baby forever. They don't like babies because babies are competition for care.
Yes, exactly. That's exactly right.
That is right. So, I mean,
so actually, I had to sorry, Alex, just quickly, and this is like a half-formed thought, but it is almost like a child's view or a child's theory of the family. I think that's one of the problems with Firestone as well.
Right.
Starting from this perspective of the child questioning authority, undermining it, essentially almost anarchistic, and not sort of, recognizing that there is a necessity, I would at least argue, of having some sort of authority within society, of various different sorts perhaps. But it does seem like a kind of, and that's in some ways undermining the political agency of the adults to say, children, you're just as much a political agent as I am. Well, no, there has to be that division between adults and children if you're gonna kind of take
otherwise it's meaningless.
I want to read a quote that I actually, and this is from Surrogacy Now, but it's reiterated in Abolish the Family. How might we develop together with children an understanding that it is not nature but love in all its contingency that is the real source of the stability to which all children have a right. And I have, well, you can't, because they're children. We don't listen to those assholes about anything. They don't know what they're talking about. But also, the way children developmentally understand the family, whether it's biological, extended, or anything, is that it's natural. Abstract conceptions of like love or an intentional social formation, maybe when they're 12 or 13 or something, but it doesn't matter if they, if they're raised by grandparents or if they're adopted and know it or whatever, their understanding developmentally of family is that it is something natural because they are creatures of nature. What parenting is they give you an animal and then you kind of nudge it as it becomes a person. Like, you provide a context for it to not get hurt so that it can develop into a person. And, there's some guidance involved, but honestly, I still come from the position that a lot of parenting is just being around, benign neglect, feed them, don't beat them, pay attention, But like, what are you talking about? This collaborative thing with children? They eat Tide Pods. They're morons. I love them, but they're very stupid and they don't know what's going on. They literally, physically, intellectually do not have the capacity to think of an abstract concept of family. They're like, this is my unit. The first trauma you have is realizing that your mother or whatever your caregiver isn't an arm that you can flex. That it isn't a limb, that it's a different person. The first trauma is different person. Your first word, no matter what it is mother, because it's a screaming wail you make to call over the person you need to change you or hold you or feed you, which is a metonym in baby for mother or parent or caregiver or whatever. They are natural creatures. Like, the whole point of parenting is to get them out of that. So they're not little animals. It's just very utopian about children. It's very, as much as she dislikes the Victorian idea of it, it's very cult of childhood. And I think Firestone is a little guilty of this as well, where it's like, there's this pure kind of Rousseauian little imp sprite that develops on its own. And, you see, the only thing I found comparable that I've seen lately was there's an anti diet, like parenting mommy blogger, where people are like, well, what do I want to do if my kids just want to eat Oreos? And she's like, let them. Otherwise, they'll get body issues. And, actually, if you restrict what they have, they're more likely to rebel and have weight problems later. And it's like, there's literally no evidence to support that at all. Like, children eat what you give them. And again, like, one of the reasons you introduce foods early is because you have to develop a palate. Like, that's where intervention comes. They're not like, I think I'll try sushi today. Like, they go towards the familiar, and the familiar tends to be the first thing they've seen, or the thing that's around them most often. It's just a very weird. It's difficult for me to talk about this book because, like, the not just the underlying premises that she's operating on, but like the ones under that, the very deep foundations are not correct. They're not the way the world is, or the way children are, or the way parents are, or it's like, how deep can I go that it's still wrong?
And I think it's also, I can't help but thinking about all of it, like, it just strikes me like there's a weird kind of, what she wants is some kind of matriarchy, essentially. But not even in a kind of fully conscious sense, but in the sense that when she has this idea of kind of generalizing motherhood and exploding all the kind of the functions of the family and redistributing them over society as a whole, it's this, it's this kind of, it's deeply creepy, and it's very different.
I'm not sure I agree. Sorry I don't
You
think
don't
it
think
is a
you don't think it's
no.
creepy? You're
No, I don't think it's a
feeling.
generalized. I don't think it's a generalized model of motherhood, because it's more of a celebration of basically what Amber was saying, like children's innate ideas and the natural state that we're in, which actually is a repudiation of
But
the
that is
responsibility that
that
adults have
I would
for
say
No,
children.
no,
synthesis
but
of
And
that
that.
is what I meant. That is
Yeah.
what I meant there, right? So kind of, where there's some great
The
kind,
world,
there's an agency out there that will look after us,
yeah,
mother.
the world should be mother, and we all get to be baby.
Yes, exactly. But in effect, right, what it will be, right, if you did have her kind of society, it would require this kind of, it's like that, is it Raised by Wolves? Is that the name of the show, the TV show, with a
Yeah.
computer called Mother that's raising all the kids, the AI? I mean, that is kind of that would, in this kind of post-apocalyptic kind of, wasteland, that
And she
would
just
be that, the only way that she could live in that society is if you had this tremendous kind of benevolent controlling agency that cared entirely for all your needs and ministered to you, and you could be a child and we could all be kids, but it would require somebody to be kind of big mother, essentially.
So
like, as she talks
she
about
I think
this.
gives off.
Oh, I was going to say, she
No,
talks about this within terms of anti-work and the world being, she calls herself a cyborg feminist. She was a giant, like, digital bureaucratic teat for the world, and we all get to be baby
yeah.
forever.
It's techno. So I think here we're getting to it. It's techno primitivism, right? Because she, at several points in the book, hints at this idea that family abolition is kind of one at the same time decolonial, and kind of talks about pre-Columbian civilizations or something like that. And basically, that's it. It's the kind of the extended family, child rearing, kind of spread out over the tribe or whatever. But of course, this as a model for the 21st century is just bizarre. So either she's just a kind of
Is it the
straight up.
pre-Columbians who used to carve out hearts to give them to the sun, or
Yeah,
the
no.
other
Well,
pre-Columbians who
I
used to
did
live
think
in
about that. I
Brazil?
was like, not the
Which ones?
Aztecs. Probably not the Aztecs. There were other select tribes which are nicer. But what's funny is also how much this is this is, if you were to show this book, this just is every right wing, and not right wing, but kind of popular fear that is very pervasive today and well grounded, even if there's paranoid elements to it, of having everything that what little you have left taken away from you, right? That
You'll own nothing and be happy.
exactly, that the communists are going to come and take your house and take your car and take your family too. And this is just this is just exactly that. Now, what's interesting is that the right have this term, the kind of alt-right have this term, or neo-reactionaries, the longhouse, right? Which is this idea of the matriarchy, and the longhouse itself is an indigenous kind of construction where they would all live in this matriarchy. So it all kind of comes around, and it's like, oh, this book seems like it was created by kind of the alt-right as a kind of justification for their own politics. It's incredible.
It's another cognitive dissonance thing where she argues against naturalism and that there's anything good about being natural, or even that there's anything natural about being natural. But then she sort of reverts to like whatever pre-modern society and like says that we're all, but the way a lot of traditional societies are organized are micro level things where you have daycares or your grandmother takes care of a kid. They still have a mother and father usually, unless it's a society where there's very extreme conditions where like polygamy exists or something. The techno primitivism thing is very weird. It's like we're all going to be digital tribesmen, but one, I don't think she doesn't want to do what tribesmen do, which is like also have to go out and hunt and provide for people. And also she doesn't really want to know how they actually operate, which can be like fairly complex systems of like social and labor organizations, so that you essentially have daycares. It's like what you think is like a radical thing. It's just a daycare aside.
Yeah, and they're normative and regulated informally, right? And she's pretty antinomian by the sounds of it, right? It's all go out and have queer sex, and I'm sounding like some kind of like ranty conservative. Go out and have queer sex all the time. You gotta get work, but like that's kind of her vision. So anyway, what I wanted to bring up, because I want to move away a little bit from Sophie Lewis to talk a little bit more broadly about contemporary liberal left, postmodern thought, whatever, which is not just this kind of little weird left wing thing, but I think seems to have an element of confluence with social policy, for example. Anyway, so it's this idea that, as Sophie Lewis says, the family is doing a bad job at care, and we all deserve better. The family is getting in the way of alternatives. Yeah.
Citation, please. The family isn't getting in the way of anything. The family's losing. But also, family doing a bad job of care compared to what? That she loves that phrase, by the way. Compared to what? And she says, the families are good compared to what? And it's like, well, then you just said families are bad. And like, that's the answer compared to what? Like, the source family that fucked all the kids? Like what? Like, I don't.
Well, and a lot of state policy, rather than providing welfare, has been concerned with this idea that family is getting in the way of providing care, and without really providing the capacity and resources to have a family, sustain a kind of stable, decent family life, and instead, kind of pursue interventions which interfere with the autonomy of parents and so on. And like, but the left seems, broadly speaking, to be to go along with this perception of things and to be concerned with care. And I think this is worth asking, why, to use a term that Dustin Guastella used in a recent piece in Damage, of antisocial socialism, why antisocial socialism is centrally preoccupied with care today.
Okay, first of all, Alex, you need to give people due when they come up with terms, right? So who came up with antisocial socialism?
Who did?
I'll give you a clue.
On the podcast?
Somebody who was writing critiques. Yeah, somebody who was writing fucking criticisms of the lockdown left, the socialists who were opposed to society.
Yeah.
Before Dustin Guastella kind of started talking about antisocial socialism. So, in answer to the care,
it's basically all there in the Communist Manifesto anyway, so whatever.
Well
well done,
Thank you. Well, look, I mean, if we can't big ourselves up on the pod, George, where can we, right?
Yeah.
In the answer to the question about care, right, this branch of thought is centrally preoccupied with care. I mean, it's partly that kind of, like we were saying, it's the kind of that longing for protection, and the longing for security and stability and all the rest of that in a world in which the precariousness is felt also by the scions of the middle class, who kind of confront a world which has turned out not to be the one that they were sold or the one that they expected. And I think it's also it's an expression of the inability to think of social transformation, so instead of thinking of society as something which is potentially transformable and that social relations are manipulable, or at least through politics, instead what you seek is security. I think it's another variant of preferring security to liberty.
So I was going to say sort
right.
of like the opposite is that what she like. But this is the cognitive dissonance thing, where she somehow simultaneously holds both position. And there's always going to be an antagonism between sort of liberty and security, or if you like, autonomy and safety or something like that. But there's the other thing is that, like, she believes you're like freer to abuse in a family situation, but you are free to ignore in this defamilied situation. It's like you have too many freedoms within a family, but then it's very restrictive in terms of freedom. I don't quite understand what she's talking about a lot of the time.
Well, I think this is where the kind of like techno AI mother image that Phil referenced earlier might be actually kind of the key to understanding the vision, because it's a world where the family imposes work, right, and it's unpaid labor, especially on women, and so she wants to be freed from that. Okay, good. And in that vision, in which the family is exploded, it's abolished, people are free to make their own connections and commitments to each other, although it seems that commitment isn't a major concern of hers. In fact, everyone's pretty free floating here. There is no commitment, there's no responsibility, obligation, or duty within this. Care is important, but care then is outsourced to the, I guess, sovereign mother who cares for the people, and people are allowed to be free there. Now, no one actually works in this. No one performs the amount of socially necessary labor to reproduce society. And I don't mean reproduce society literally in terms of child having and rearing. I mean just actually reproducing our material world in its entirety. No one's actually doing that. And therefore, this is a world, I think this is another way in which these visions are completely cut off from any concern and notion of production, whether affirmatively or critically. Just production just is something that happens somehow magically off in the distance, and life is able to continue. And therefore, why should you be working in this world? You should be, caring for one another, or going off and having queer sex while techno mother cares for you.
But there's another question here, which is like, why is care so important? I think you've got to give people their props when they come up with new social theories, and this is from Pete Ramsey. This idea of vulnerability as ideology. It's like care is particularly important the more that you think that individuals are vulnerable or vulnerated, i.e., have already suffered that injury, and the more central that trauma is, the more you're going to say that care is the thing that the subject needs the most. So I think that's probably the ultimate cause of all this antisocial socialism, is that people have internalized that politics of fear. And that's a very heavily summarized version of Pete's essays that we should link to in the show notes. But I think that's kind of central. If you start from that position of the individual, that's what you need more than anything. You don't need kind of political control or political rights or whatever. You need care.
Stupid babies need the most attention.
Well, yeah, quite.
Okay, so to sort of extend from that, it goes into the anti-work stuff too, where it's caring for yourself, and it doesn't have a lot of caring for others though, and it doesn't seem like there's any consideration of people might enjoy. It reminds me very much of kind of the second wave, radical feminism being you're being penetrated, it's injury to you. And it's yeah, I like it. And whether that's socialized or not, you're not going to sell people on it. And I think to the degree to which socialist projects should be involved in sort of shaping desires, the baseline of, say, do you want socialized healthcare that's distributed by the state? Someone might be like, ooh, or no. But if you say, do you want healthcare? The answer is yes. If you say, hey, do you want more daycare available? Do you want child credits, more time? They would say yes. But if you said, do you want to abolish the family and parent communally? They would say absolutely not. And it's a thing that's happening sort of more often within desperation. Like mutual aid is just poor people sharing what little they have. But she talks a lot about mutual aid. And I think it's another example of taking a trend that has been accelerating, which is the degradation of families, saying we should do it. And actually it's good. It's trying to change what people want instead of trying to change the world. And sort of condescending to people's actual impulses and desires. And it's who are you talking to?
That's bang
who
on,
are you
yeah.
talking to is a good thing to ask any writer. And you should be able to come up with some kind of an answer, even if it takes you a while. Other than her fellow, provocateur, radical liberal, primitivist cyborg feminist, this doesn't apply. What is the point of again, another cognitive dissonance? She calls it utopian, but it's this is a dystopia. You describe all the horrible ways in which, or you describe a lot of horrible ways in which families are commodified and attacked by capital. And then you say, what if we finish that project and if we finish that project, the dystopia will become a utopia. It's kind of a atomization
Yeah, absolutely. That's it.
accelerationist.
That's it. I mean, I
She's
think a lot of
pissing
the
on
kind
our
of
shoes and
radical
telling us
liberal,
it's raining.
yeah, radical liberal left, I think, is fundamentally their objective, their whole politics is accelerationist, but not in the way that that term used to be used. It's
Mhm.
kind of about just ripping up what little of society there is, and I think this is something which strikes me about discussions of patriarchy, right? That somehow the patriarchy has to be reconstructed to be dethroned once again. While the reality is that there is no patriarchy, and likewise with racism, we have to rebuild up racism as much as possible to then attack it.
Job security,
Yeah, I
And
mean,
baby.
so I mean, she kind of mentions, and I mentioned it before, the Communist Manifesto, and this idea that capitalism has basically already abolished the family, and she does mention this, but I think if you really kind of exactly what you were saying, Amber, it's like this is the way things are moving anyway. So how radical is it to say let's just take this existing trend and basically take it to its completion?
Yeah.
That it seems to me like that's probably in some ways the most damning criticism you can have of it, that for all the kind of radical framing, is it actually that radical, taking something which is already kind of happening or happened and just taking it to the next stage and trying to change people's desires, as you said, so that they like it rather than oppose it? It
She would
seems,
say a
are you
full
changing the material?
a half dystopia bad, a full dystopia good. Like gotta be the handmaiden of the.
Yeah.
And you know what? It's accelerationism with no endpoint. Like it's not like, oh, we wreck everything and then a good thing happens. It's like we wreck everything and that is the good thing.
Yeah, well, it's not like pushing these contradictions to their logical conclusion will then somehow reveal a new situation which is revolutionary when we're suddenly completely freed of all kind of social bonds, that
But I
now
don't think
we're
she
kind
thinks
of
it's a
going to be truly revolutionary.
I don't think she thinks it's a new situation. Like I think she's like what she's describing is just the things that happen to poor people all the time. I when my mom was pregnant, she lived in my mama's house, and we lived with my grandpa till I was 5, and you know, had various family arrangements like that. That's a thing that's already happening and has been happening forever, and is more meaningful to working class people just because it's a question of resources. So I, what she's describing isn't a new situation. It's the way I grew up. It's the way most, I think, working class kids grew up, and even a lot of middle class kids, especially if they come from fucking immigrant families, and like Yaya lives with you. Um, but there's just no other side of the acceleration. It's just we'll finish the project, we'll finish what capital is doing, and then it will be good.
Yeah, it there's an
It's not
absence
new.
of utopia even in the vaguest sense here, which is weird because I picked up this book thinking, okay, well, I'm not going to agree with it most likely, but at least I'll get a sense of what her image is of the post family abolition world is, where we're all holding
Mhm.
hands and sharing things, and things are plentiful and abundant, at least in terms of free time, if not material wealth, and children are raised in such a way that I don't know. I thought I was expecting something, and you don't get that actually at all. It's just the destruction of the accelerating the destruction that's already ongoing.
Yeah, I mean, it's not necessary if you want to kind of say to abolish something to have a ready-made alternative. But there are, generally the way that kind of movement goes is to identify what characteristics it is that are, cancelled, transcended, taken to the next level. And I thought she was going to do that in the kind of the conclusion, where she starts throwing away around these $5 words like Aufhebung and all this sort of thing. I was like, oh yeah, I can kind of see where this might be going. But partly I think it is that there isn't really the kind of conditions for seeing what an abolished family would look like. Like you can't kind of just come up with this, or you can't kind of just do it intellectually. There has to be a movement that's driving this forward. And And that's not, that's not really the case at this point in time. There's no real movement towards the abolition of the family. I wouldn't say, except for the capitalist one, which is just one of endless kind of atomization at this point.
Yeah, and it benefits capital to own the. I would throw into that broadly. She's in the techno-utopian realm of thinking that bodies are the problem, like bodies like the fundamental oppressor or whatever. So she has a very she would, I think, position as like I'm framing pregnancy realistically, and it's like, no, there's a lot of projection and action words on there. Like, I think it's fair to describe birth as violent, but pregnancy is cancerous. The sun is fucking cancerous. We do things to ourselves all the time that aren't good for us. Is the idea to keep us in like pristine little boxes so that, with regardless of like personality or hobbies or doing anything, are we never supposed to smoke? Are we never supposed to like get a little drunk? Are we never supposed to play sports? Are we never supposed to have children? Are we never supposed to look? I am driving this car, okay? I want to get out of life with some scratches on it. Like, it's this idea that we have to be sort of preserved and encapsulated. It's very weird.
I think it's really part of it, because it's so she cites the statistics about family being, the site of all this kind of abuse and torment and trauma and what have you. But I think the real kind of, beneath that, or what's motivating that kind of thrust, is the objection to the fact that, those things are not abuse, but, certainly, like Amber, like you said before, that kind of the trauma that's just part of becoming an adult and a person that's involved in kind of becoming independent. She wants a world in which there is no kind of vulnerability, essentially, and there's no possibility of being let down or being kind of at risk, but it's not the case, because, we are intrinsically vulnerable, and therefore inevitably you will be put at risk. And so this is what makes me think that there really is kind of underlying the whole kind of structure of the argument, such as it is this desire for perfect security, which can only, and it's like that, it's a fantasy, like I say, of the kind of omnipotent mother. That's the only way I can see it.
Yeah, and I think it is also the fantasy of conflict-free living, which is something that, when I looking back at Lash's work, also kind of, it's something that comes through quite clearly in his depictions of the post-60s left, and it's obviously still with us, but it's an ideal of family living, of interpersonal relations, which can be shed of conflict. And obviously, the more we detach from one another, the more this ideal seems possible, that we can have conflict-free living, that we can be effectively, not have the bumps and scrapes that life will inevitably give you in the best of circumstances. And I think the family abolition one is also kind of very much part of that vision. So just to close off, one last question, I guess, which is, something that I've already made reference to, which is, the left in 2023 seems more like a phalanx attacking crumbled structures, whether it's patriarchy, racism, productivism, things that have largely been overcome or withered away within kind of, or due to capitalism's own advance, rather than kind of the forces of radical politics kind of taking them apart. And I wonder what the function of this all is, if the left is a party dedicated to attacking crumbling structures or already crumbled structures.
It's a good question, I think, because that is probably where this book and this kind of line of thought ultimately sits. And I was kind of thinking about this, like it is almost like, it sounds like bad to say it, but like a loyalty test almost, that within this kind of group or this sort of set of ideas, will you advocate for these kind of quite provocative sort of set of ideas? And that sort of thing is that's a good way to kind of to bind a group together and to kind of make it more more capable of furthering its own interests. You don't want to kind of be quite so reductive, but probably it does come back to class, and that there is a specific class to which these, you don't want to talk about the PMC all day every day, but in this case maybe this term is applicable because this might be the constituency of these ideas, and they are quite maybe that idea of going into a bar and talking to people about this, that almost becomes a positive thing, because the fact is that is distinction, and that differentiates the advocates of abolishing the family from quote unquote normal people. So yeah, I mean, it is a good question,
but so
right?
there are a few options, right? So I mean, there's the so in terms of you outlined this, Alex, but there's a few kind of political options. So there's girl boss feminism, where either you can afford surrogacy or you can afford private childcare. There's surrogacy, which there is some surrogacy which is kind of at least as far as I've read, which is kind of people not looking to either to survive or to profit, but simply to extend the possibility of giving other people a family, and that it's not based on purely a kind of indeed, right?
She hates those women now.
And then there's
that's the one she likes.
Indeed,
is the one that are
and
doing
then you
it
have the
under duress.
trans Marxism, as you say. So, and I think probably she falls closest to that. And then you have her kind of position, and that seems to me the kind of her position is the kind of it's the hipster network in the urban, kind of in cramped urban living, like I put it earlier. That is the kind of the sphere of care, of support structures, which is both kind of material and effective. And that's where it kind of sits in all of these political options that lie before you. And that is the loyalty test, I think, that George was talking about. That's this, for this group, that's their vision of living. So, instead of like paying for, I don't know, like a Thai or, I don't know, like Guatemalan kind of teenager to carry your kid for you, or to have like a Romanian nanny if you're like a Remainer in the UK or whatever it might be. In this vision, it's a loyalty test for a different group of people in terms of what they want from life and how they envisage their life.
Yeah, and to the extent of which they actually believe that, or if they've just irony poisoned themselves into thinking they believe it because they forgot they were kidding, it's not clear. But there's definitely like something there. I would say that this general thrust is actually the greatest manifestation of liberalism. It was the most like, it was the most like fighting monsters then become one, because it sort of it doesn't just fall in line. It does the work of saying like, we don't need institutions. Your job as a radical is to smash, which obviously has more novelty and more fun, and it's leisure. Building things, now that's work, and work is bad, is what we've decided. Even if it's something you would do with no financial remuneration, like parenting or making a fucking chair or, painting or gardening or whatever, it's all work. The only difference between that and, waged labor is a wage. Again, pretty big difference. But you have do what you love mindset. You don't know the difference between work and leisure. And building things is work, so you don't want to do it. And I'm not saying building things isn't work. I'm not saying parenting like isn't work. I'm just saying like there is joy to work, and one of the true like arguments on behalf of the family, not insofar as like the family as like an economic unit, the way Ingalls would say. Not that, but like the sense of family that we have, which is already sort of mixed and matched with neighbors, friends, extended family, not for her because she's bourgeois, but like already has been, to the extent that that is a good thing is like, one, it's economic. Like, no, I don't mean in terms of money, but in terms of like economies of care. It's way difficult. Have you ever like worked at an editor's or worked at a magazine or been doing something where 5 editors go through something? It's just impractical. And I think you have to think about the practical end of parenting because it is a practical job. And two, I think it's good for you to not have to choose everything in your life. I think it's good for you to get a randomly assigned people, whether it's through adoption or biology or your neighbors or whatever, integrated families, like the whole absolute freedom all the time, freedom from work, freedom from responsibility. It sounds like a very listless, sad thing. And when I hear about, I feel the love of my queer network and family, and like, yeah, but you're really unhappy. And again, I'm trying not to get into like any kind of personal attack, but this is like an incredibly sad person. And you're living the lifestyle that you prescribe, because it's essentially a lifestyle. It's not a political program. It's the opposite of a political program. She's George Soros and the EU combined when it comes to sort of like social fabric. She's just keeping doing that work. That's the only work she's willing to do, is like breaking stuff down, because it can be described as novelty or leisure. And it just becomes this circular thing. But it's like, you're fighting for a world that's already encroaching. It's like you're saying, actually, the tidal wave is good as the shadow forms over our head. When she makes no arguments for the positive aspects of family and the reasons why it has existed. And she's sort of positioning it all under the idea that like, it's bad because I don't get to be baby anymore. I don't get to be baby forever. I want to be a brain in a jar and baby forever.
Yeah, exactly. Bang on. All right, I think we'll leave this here. We've criticized Sophie Lewis enough, but I hope, listener, that this has been useful also in kind of sketching out certain tendencies, both in society at large and also politically, in terms of those who are looking to maybe accelerate some of the worst tendencies in contemporary society. Thank you for listening. Thanks, Amber, for joining us. This has been fun.
Yeah, thanks. It's the first time
she knows
I've
she's welcome
podcasted
on
in a
any
long
time.
Yeah. Hey, if you ever want to do a follow-up with full surrogacy, I just finished that and have extensive notes because it's weird.
Yeah. Well, if we if we have we can just maybe make this the anti Sophie Lewis podcast and run with that there. Just be fully destructive. All right. That's it from us for now. Catch you later. Bye-bye.
Bye.